betrayal as well as neglect. And those stories are all the way from pages 4 to 8 on this paper, but also on the front page, Trump shock for Kenya. Incoming President Donald Trump is alarmed by the corruption and hints at a possible withdrawal of U.S. support on the war on terror. But let's begin with the El Adde attack. I mean, 1 year on, we still have families who have not had closure. Kenyans still don't know the numbers of soldiers who died at El Adde. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on El Adde is that there has been a cover-up, a systematic cover-up aided and abetted by the media in failing to actually investigate what happened there. The troops at El Adde they're our troops, the KDF, assigned to AMISOM. They really didn't have the basic tools with which to fight Al-Shabaab.
Right.
But since then, since January 15th of 2016, we have had a welter of confusion, of mixed signals about what actually happened. Reading through the detailed, untold story, the number of troops at El Adde were many more than I initially expected and said.
I mean, the official reports say 141 soldiers
were possibly killed.
Right.
Now, the thing is, your reports, the individuals who were there and who seem to have gotten away or possibly even used their phones to call for help,
Right.
which is a no-no in the real-world military operations, seem to indicate there were 250 to 280
Right.
KDF members assigned to the base. I initially had articles published in the Weekend Star on the 2nd and 3rd of last year, a one-page El Adde report in which I estimated a reinforced rifle company, possibly 200, 220 troops, out of which I thought at the time anywhere from 115, 120 had actually been killed.
Right.
I think the 140 figure is very accurate.
Because you do have a witness account here saying about 200, more than 200 possibly killed.
Well, we believe that 40 of the troops managed to make their way 80 kilometers to the Kenyan border without their weapons.
Right.
They apparently got out of the compound. That's an entire platoon managed to escape, apparently didn't fight. We don't know exactly what's been going on with them. There are rumors that they're being court-martialed.
Right.
But we hear nothing.
Let's talk about that. You've been in this, you've been in the military, you've been in the security docket for quite a while. And like you mentioned, those who escaped probably used phones to call for help, which is a no-no in security. And that's where the story of neglect and betrayal comes in because, for example, the survivor who is giving their story on the Standard this morning says that they are being punished for not staying and fighting for their country.
Well, the only eyewitness account that we have of the attack, and it's heavily edited, comes from Al-Shabaab, their propaganda video.
Right.
But what it showed is that there were no real defensive positions at El Adde. That camp seems to have been established initially for a battalion, 600-700 troops, plus the attached units. It was being manned, not just this time, but also the previous deployment. There was a reinforced rifle company. It's questionable whether the defenses were ever adjusted by the company commander or by or at the order of the AMISOM force commander, who has said nothing in 12 months. These troops were under the operational control of AMISOM. The AMISOM force commander has said nothing about the death of also his boys in combat. This goes to the problem that AMISOM has been funded to fail. AMISOM does not have the sort of assets that we in the Marine Corps 40 years ago expected to have when we walked out into the bush. There's no close air support. There's insufficient artillery support. The fact that we say there are 22,000 troops assigned to AMISOM does not mean there are 22,000 combat troops.
Right.
There may be 60% of the 22,000 are actually out in the bush, able to go head-to-head with Al-Shabaab. And the only difference between an AMISOM trooper, a KDF soldier, and Al-Shabaab is that our guys wear Kevlar and boots. And Al-Shabaab, they don't wear helmets, and they wear sandals. Otherwise, we have put our people as riflemen, rifle against rifle, as if what's been going on in the world since, I don't know, 1930s has never taken place. But the Kenya Defense Forces have been trained, initially equipped, to fight the way we were trained to fight in the Marine Corps. There's no reason why Kenyans cannot do the same thing.
Right. Right. I mean, and even as we acknowledge the act of courage by the soldiers that lost their lives in El Adde, you have for the longest time been a critic of KDF soldiers being in Somalia, especially after the Operation Linda Nchi. And let's take a look at this article, an article here that you wrote back in 2011.
Yes.
That is, what, 5.5 years ago?
That's correct. That was published in the Business Daily.
So the headline here is, after Somalia, Kenya must move to secure its borders. And your take here was that after the Operation Linda Nchi, that KDF soldiers should be withdrawn from Somalia in phases, but that did not happen. We've seen the government take a very strong stance that they will not withdraw KDF troops. What impact do you think this has had?
Well, when I wrote the article, which was published on December 12th, 2011, there were roughly 1,800 to 2,000 Kenyan Defense Forces still in Somalia. It was a legally allowable, it was a punitive expedition that we can launch against hostiles across our borders. Right. At that time, the troops, had they been withdrawn, into forward combat bases, not into the barracks. This was not a concession to Al-Shabaab. This was to reorganize, re-equip, and be much more effective at killing Al-Shabaab. Right. We increased that, and this was under the government of national unity. This was the Prime Minister, everyone was in agreement that this so-called war on terror must be prosecuted all the way to Kismayo. We had what in effect became, in the United States, we referred to as mission creep, but in fact, we kept increasing our personnel in Somalia, going after towns, going after road networks, and we were there until we had 4,500 troops.
Right.
That's been scaled back to roughly 3,600. The point is, we don't have a gigantic military. We don't have endless numbers of troops. The longer we sit in these prepared positions, and El Adde was just a defensive position that wasn't very well prepared, we are undermining our own military efficiency and our own military effectiveness. It's not good to leave troops in a place where they don't feel supported. They don't believe that there's any real mission. My understanding, not over and above what I read this morning, is that the weapons are old. Right. The ammunition, this limitation of ammunition to 100 rounds per soldier, per rifle, apparently was some sort of administrative measure taken because somebody had, I don't know, they were either losing ammunition or expending it without orders. What this has shown, though, is that instead of having a combined arms force, that is that when you're being attacked, your troops know where to go in your position, and then you can get on the military radios to call in airstrikes, to call for support. Again, I noticed and brought to the attention of people like John Allen Namu back in 2012 that these cute stories how the troops are calling home on their mobile phones it may be a nice human interest story, but what it tells anyone who's been in uniform is that there's no discipline, that you're not controlling communications. And of course, and I don't pretend to be an IT expert, as you know, but if you can track people's telephones, obviously you can track where they are. You can see where they are. It's bad for morale to have troops calling home, not because you don't want them talking about bad things, but because any soldier, any Marine on the battlefield or anywhere has just a small vision of that battlefield. And you fight for the guy on your right and your left. You don't know the big picture. You may think you do. I mean, as a lieutenant, I thought I did, and then when I got promoted, I realized how little I actually knew. So you don't want people being able to just speak out to the world, because they can give the wrong impression. Almost 5.5 years later, it seems that the impression that we should have been taking has been true. That the reason for calling this a war on terror is to get U.S. support. And this has been, in fact, a situation since 9/11. And in our case, that is in Kenya, and I've been here for nearly 36 years, Michelle, we are willing to, as long as the troops are there, it's not our job to ask how they're doing, what the Kenya Defense Forces or the Kenya government is doing with the assistance we provide. We have had training missions here to provide support to the Kenyan military and how to recover pilots who are down behind enemy lines. This is fair. And this was on the basis of no one is left behind. Now, the training occurred, I think, in August or September of 2016. And the KDF spokespeople were saying this is about no one left behind. We believe there are 10 to 12 soldiers. Well, we can't account for every body. We can't account for every dead body from El Adde. We believe there are missing in action. We believe there may be POWs. And yet we don't hear anything about what's going on to recover them. This was a big issue in the 1960s, and especially in the 1970s after Vietnam, which we withdrew from under the not very great circumstances. Right. We won every battle and lost the war. But the families of the missing in action, the prisoners of war, became a very potent political force in America. Bring our boys home. With the development of forensics, DNA, there's a laboratory in Hawaii run by the Pentagon, which goes out looking for the remains of those who died. Troops.
I mean, because when you take a look at the dailies this morning, you see a lot of stories of families still in agony. Many mothers actually still waiting for their sons to return home because they need that closure. And we have stories of families that have buried the wrong bodies because the DNA testing was a bit rushed. And, you know, the very fact that you mentioned that nobody is speaking out on these efforts and whether, you know, any effort is being done for the rest of the recovered bodies to be brought home. In the same article, you write that any security planning in Kenya related to probably regaining territorial sovereignty should be clearly stated and very transparent. Has that been seen in Kenya?
No, it has not. We have had a series of tactical defeats. We have had problems domestically with Garissa University, Westgate, and Pekatoni. We have a drumbeat of steady cascade, a drumbeat of defeats, of failures. And it is not, if I were sitting in the States and someone said, well, we're working on it, I wouldn't believe them at all.
Right.
Okay? Because maybe I'm just a bit too old-fashioned. No, I don't trust people in the U.S. government necessarily to look out for my best interests, especially if I don't speak out.
Right.
I've seen that here in Kenya with the U.S. government people. But here, unless things are transparent, this is not, national security does not require us to hide our policies. It doesn't, and it also doesn't require us to hide our mistakes.
Right.
We had some very bad operations, that is the Marine Corps, in 1975, where basically untrained Marines were sent into a combat area.
Right.
And that was not looked into very closely for a number of years. That was a mistake. However, when our barracks in Beirut was blown up in 1983, and 241 service members were killed, 227 Marines, there were major investigations into why that happened. How did a suicide bomber manage to drive through our checkpoint? And as it turned out, our sentries, Marines at that time, there was a problem with live ammunition. That is, Marines were not supposed to have their weapons loaded in Lebanon or even in the States. And this became a huge scandal. And the Marine Corps from that point on began treating Marines like grown-ups, or as if they were civilians able to buy as many weapons as they want. But that came about because there were very serious investigations that did not. It was embarrassing, a lot of the things that were uncovered. Because we had a lot of problems. But the longer you cover things up, you end up in a situation where you have Marines guarding a gate in Beirut without ammunition in their weapons.
And I mean, let's touch on an issue on the dailies this morning as well. This anonymous soldier, of course, who's giving their recount of the El Adde attack, says that this is a position that they had to bribe 250,000 shillings to get into. I mean, let's begin with that, issues of integrity within the police force.
Well, this was the KDF.
Yes.
Okay. To have to bribe to go into a combat zone, it's because of the extra pay you receive. It becomes a plum assignment for African troops. In many ways, this sort of mirrors what happens when you get bogged down in a war that goes on and on and on, where the bureaucracy just seems to be assigning people. Friends get assigned. The unhappy aspect, though, of this kind of administrative chaos, this failure of administration, is also troublemakers get assigned to bad places.
Right.
And this goes on everywhere in the world, and which doesn't make it right, because it erodes the discipline of your military. absolutely undermines the combat effectiveness of the troops. It makes everybody complicit in a sort of a cover-up, being quiet, saying nothing. I also think that for guys in uniform to anywhere to look at what happened at El Adde, our guys are not stupid. The KDF, they're not dumb. They won't take chances. They can see a year on that people they may have known, family members, are dead.
Right.
You know, we talk about patriotism, but most of the time you go out there and nobody, once you get a little bit more mature, nobody wants to be under fire. And you fight for the people around you. You don't fight necessarily for your country.
Right.
You might fight for your corps. But the truth of the matter is that you don't fight very hard, and you don't go out of your way to put yourself in harm's way if you don't believe there's any support.
Right.
And I think what we've seen in 12 months is the families are left on their own, which is unconscionable.
Right.
It's unconscionable from any point of view.
Now, we do have a few families that have been compensated, although some are still waiting for compensation. But let's focus on the U.S. support on the war on terror here in Kenya. And now we've had incoming President-elect Donald Trump threaten to withdraw his support on the war on terror because he says we seem to be failing in what we're doing in Somalia. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's about time that we look at all of our foreign assistance programs as to their effectiveness, as to the results, as to what is actually being accomplished. And that includes whether you're providing assistance to a Ministry of Health that after how many years of essentially peace still cannot deliver aspirin to clinics out there in the bush. It's the effectiveness of our assistance. I've seen over the last 10, 15 years that people in the U.S. government who are assigned here, as well as in NGOs, but this is true across all the diplomatic missions, are not required to demonstrate, well, anything besides, well, the money it gets to the NGO. It hasn't been stolen, but it's been used to facilitate, to build capacity, to discuss, to look into. It is not designed, nobody goes out on a career limb and to sacrifice their careers to actually go out and say, why don't you have this? Why don't you do this? Diplomats don't have to do that. But who is responsible for asking where the money is being spent? We look at the Afia House scandals, so-called scandals. That money can be traced, I believe, to 99 containers, 40-foot containers sitting in Mombasa. I think the director of the company seemed a bit nonplussed about I won the tender and I delivered them. What he was essentially saying is the government made policy choices. The policy choices. We need to have mobile clinics. This is a good idea. How it was implemented was not the job of the people responding to the tenders. But whose job is it to look into? Well, we know that the National Assembly is supposed to look into that. And if it deals in the counties, we have devolution, senators, governors. And yet, we have all this money being spent, we have stuff being procured, and we don't seem to have any results. And I think that's what the impetus is behind the Trump questions to the State Department. It's very simply, how do you ignore what's going on in various countries? Right. The reality, look, with all due respect to everybody, you've been pointing out one of my articles, I've been advising or recommending since 2011 a better way to fight Al-Shabaab. Why should the U.S. government continue funding training and assistance and equipment if nobody is listening to a former U.S. Marine who lives in Kenya? And I'm not saying anything controversial. You will never see corruption.
That advice that you've been giving, still with this same article, that one was to withdraw KDF from Somalia, and you say withdrawing KDF from Somalia is not about saving face. Then what is it about? Well,
it's about reorganizing, being more combat effective, and to be able to defend the borders. It is, in fact, being able to accommodate legitimate national security concerns of Kenya as a sovereign state, not as part of some sideshow in our war on this global war on terror, which I noticed when General Mattis was being interviewed as part of going to become our Secretary of Defense, Senator McCain and others asked him, we seem to be spending, we send 50 troops here, 300 troops here. This is how we're somehow managing to get back into Iraq, Syria. We're bogged down in Afghanistan.
Right.
What's been going on in Somalia, and particularly since Al Adde, there has been an uptick in U.S. Special Forces operations in support perhaps of the Ugandans, in support possibly of the KDF and the Somali National Army. And we are doing these self-defense, we call them self-defense airstrikes, whether with drones or fixed-wing aircraft from Djibouti. And that is the fire support you would expect if you're on the ground. But our troops, our special forces, are not supposed to be involved in combat. And you may say, well, that's a bit of sophistry. What the Trump transition team has also asked about is, why do we have 100 Green Berets sitting in the middle of Africa chasing Joseph Kony?
Right.
Where is our national interest, the American national interest, in doing that? It's pointed out that Joseph Kony, a Ugandan, is no longer very high on the radar of the Ugandans. So what are we doing? It's great for our U.S. contractors, sure. Oh, it's great for U.S. business involved in dealing death and destruction in the private sector, but it doesn't accomplish anything. Looking at whether Somalia is valuable to the national interest of America is what the U.S. government is supposed to be looking at. Whether the Kenyans remain in Somalia, is that the best way to guarantee our domestic security, our national security? And I've been contending very publicly that it is not, that we need a much more robust policy that is based on the national interests of Kenya, if we withdraw from Somalia, we don't necessarily have to withdraw from Amazon. You don't have to be physically in Sector 2. But we have to question, the Somali National Army has been a work in progress by Amazon for how many years? The Trump transition team has pointed out, 10 years. But the history is nice. But we don't have local troops able to function. In the case of Al Adde, the Somali National Army, in close proximity to the KDF base, left. They left the scene. I would have left as well if I were in their shoes.
Right. I mean, and that is a question many are asking, because you see, 100, 200 of your colleagues down, and you have no other way of fighting back. What's the next course of action?
Well, I think the Al Adde again shows it was a lack of leadership, but it's also a lack of leadership up the entire chain. The government here needs to demand, and this is true of the Ugandans as well, needs to demand of the African Union, the EU, the United States, look, if you want our troops to be there in Somalia, you have to give us the same tools that you give your own troops. If you were to send 25 or 30,000 Marines to secure Somalia for 5 to 10 years, if it's that important to us, Marines would not be going into combat in old armored vehicles, would not be going into combat without radios, they wouldn't be trying to use mobile phones. They certainly wouldn't be sort of left out there. And Marines, of course, wouldn't have to bribe anybody to go into combat. It's one of the things Marines want to do. But the point is, they would be fighting as a modern combat organization, which is what the Kenya Defense Forces can do. It has been a modern force in the past. It should be a modern force today.
We are fighting against insurgents who are also very tech-savvy and very up-to-date with the latest combat equipment.
Well, I think what you mentioned when you refer to insurgents. See, insurgency is all about people taking up arms for whatever reason and fighting government, fighting the authorities, fighting to establish their own lives. An insurgency is based on local conditions, local problems. And whether you're talking about Wajir, Mandera, Garissa, Lamu counties, Tana River counties, all of which are now off limits, according to the U.S. government, as being terror hotspots. A lot of what causes people to take up arms is, in fact, a lack of government services, discrimination, perceptions of discrimination, failures to share the national cake-out. Across the border in Somalia, which has not had an effective government for 25 or 26 years, much of the attraction of Al-Shabaab, well, Al-Shabaab, they're not nice people. They intimidate the population. You give information to the KDF, we'll kill you. The reality is that some KDF troops who managed to escape from El Adde were sheltered by Somali families.
Right.
They were not turned in. They were not turned over to Al-Shabaab. And my understanding is that Al-Shabaab came and killed these Somalis who had given shelter, the Good Samaritans. Well, that's a prime lesson to anyone that, don't open the door. You don't get, so I don't have firsthand knowledge of how our KDF interact with the Somali population in Somalia. Incidents inside our frontline counties along the border with Somalia, that is inside Kenya, have indicated a lot of official abuse of civilians.
Right.
A lot, we have the Kenya Defense Forces deployed within our borders without the National Assembly approval, which is required for security operations by the KDF in our borders. Deploying the KDF inside the border also means that we have deferred, or we have failed to implement the National Police Service Act. We don't have reserves, proper reserves. We use the Kenya Defense Forces in lieu of an effective administration police. This has been shown in media reports, domestic media reports. It's not about foreigners. Who cares what foreign media outlets say?
Right.
It's not their job. But we have seen that administration police who should be doing these so-called border control units, rapid response they seem to be lacking a lot of logistics, a lot of support. So in other words, it seems almost systemic. But the fact is that if we throw KDF into Bonny Forest, a domestic operation, that means we don't need to look at how the police need to be upgraded and how the police need to be led. And our police could do the job too. See, one of the things I think we keep missing out on, Michelle, is the notion that being effective, whether in security force operations, somehow requires abuses of human rights, violations of human rights. That's not true at all. If you're known for torturing people, you don't get information freely given from anybody.
Right.
This is, this is not a big issue. We were taught in the Marine Corps. We never had a policy of shooting wounded enemy, torturing. There's no policy. It's counterproductive. And as was always pointed out to us in training a long time back, what happens when you're taken prisoner? Yeah. Think about that if you're hooking someone up to a car battery to run electricity through it. You see, these are it's from a basic self-survival point of view, but also it doesn't work. So if we cannot get information, if the KDF, NIS, National Intelligence Service, if the police are unable to get actionable intelligence or information from the Kenyans in these counties along the Somalia border, we have to ask, why not? It's not merely that they don't have schools. Something else is happening when you go to report suspected Al-Shabaab in your Manyara. Something happens to you that is not nice.
Right, true that. And I mean, let's focus on Trump's threat to possibly withdraw support on the war on terror. Should he make good his threat, what would that mean for AMISOM? Because the U.S. does support AMISOM largely logistically.
Well, it would be bad news for AMISOM. I don't think, however, that it's going to be a withdrawal of support willy-nilly. I believe that if it's important to defeat Al-Shabaab, for some reason, whether it's to stabilize Somalia, because Somalia is, after all, in a strategic location in the Horn of Africa, then I believe that the incoming administration and the incoming Secretary of Defense and the people around him will be able to come up with better ideas to sustain a campaign. Sustaining a campaign is very different to what we've now adopted in Somalia, which is called stabilization. Stabilization simply means we stay for a year on year on year, and we have no lasting effect. As long as U.S. boots on the ground, U.S. troops are not there full time, that's all well and good. This has been a hallmark of the Obama administration. The Obama administration, which President Obama correctly said, I didn't start the war in Iraq, I was against it from day one. But over the last 8 years, our notion of counterinsurgency has deteriorated into drones, bombing people, wedding parties in Yemen. We've expanded our campaigns that have basically had no effect other than to stir up hornets' nests, all on the basis that, well, Al-Shabaab has claimed allegiance to Al-Qaeda. Right. Al-Qaeda destroyed the World Trade Center. Therefore, Al-Shabaab is the enemy. Al-Shabaab is an insurgency, and if we're going to go after them, we should have that is the U.S., we should have a strategic reason to do so. Just as Kenya needs to have a strategic reason to defeat Al-Shabaab, to actually have troops sitting in Sector 2 forever. And I think we also have to look at a lot of the other things that the Trump administration is saying, and particularly with Kenya. Yeah, I'll make no secret of the fact, yes, I applied to be chairperson of the IEBC,
Right, yes.
or a commissioner when the law was changed to allow foreigners to apply. I didn't make it into I didn't get an interview at all. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't even get a chance to state my case.
Did you get a reason as to why that happened?
No. No one was given any reasons. That is, 720 Kenyans were denied the opportunity, were not shortlisted. The job for chairperson was re-advertised despite 14 seemingly qualified candidates having submitted their applications by the 7th of November, 2016. None of the fact that 720 or so Kenyans didn't even ask, why didn't I get selected for at least an interview is appalling.
Did you ask?
Yes, but they don't have, but in fact going in, you don't need to get a reason. This is not unusual because there is some discretion. However, the lack of interest by the media, by civil society organizations and the like, and then hearing that, Ambassador Godek pointing out that we're going to spend $25 million to $30 million on the 2017 elections. Much of that money to be channeled through this IFAS, which is a USAID recipient of money, into IEBC.
Right.
Now, I would suggest that just as not even caring about recommendations about security, I would suggest this is sort of we don't need the money that is here. Why does the IEBC has been saying do not go after IFAS? Because they fund us. If you look at what's been going on since November 7th, 2016, with the whole procedure of finding out who's best to be the chairperson or commissioners, I would suggest putting money into an organization to be led by people who came out of a flawed process may cause some red flags to go up in Washington. And it should cause red flags to go up in Washington. How effective is our spending on democracy, on good governance, on freedom of speech?
And of course, Trump, brings out a lot of issues of a corrupt regime, and that a lot of the money is being misappropriated in corruption. Is that part of the reason why? Because it's not just aid and support in terms of terror, the war on terror. It's also support for HIV/AIDS, I believe, support for elections, like you're mentioning as well.
Well, I think the elections support, I think it really should be called into question based on what's been going on with the IEBC. And that's, but I don't believe that it's the corruption. That's sort of a, it's true, obviously, but I don't believe USAID money is being stolen. Because I don't believe USAID money, as long as it's not being allocated to accomplish anything. If you have...
so if it's not being stolen and it's not accomplishing anything, then what's happening with the money?
It's being spent to facilitate development. It's being spent to build capabilities. It's being spent to exchange professional experiences. We are educating. We're providing Kenyans with the opportunity to develop local solutions to their own problems. We're not telling people, this is the inventory system you need at the Ministry of Health to ensure that all the drugs are distributed. This is what you need to do. We don't tell them that. We have endless amounts of conferences. We have, by the way, under USAID, Countering Violent Extremism, CVE. We had a huge conference in June of 2016. 4,000 or 5,000 people came. Many of the usual suspects that you often have on TV here in Kenya. Nice people came and they were left. I couldn't get an invitation to that CVE conference. Now, does that make me bitter? It makes me say, why do we have CVE? I don't believe that Muslims are our enemies. I don't buy into the narrative that radical Islamic jihadists is a global threat all the time. I don't buy into the notion that people who live along the coast and who feel marginalized because they don't go to school, they don't get ID cards, they don't have health. I don't believe that people of the ethnic Somalis in Kenya are being radicalized because they're Muslims or Islamic. I think they're being radicalized for the very same reasons that people went into the forest in 1952. That is, you can't get anything done through the courts, through law. So it's not about Muslims. It's not about Islamic radicalism. And the notion that somehow if we have enough programs, we finance enough countering violent extremism, that people will forget that they don't have jobs. They will forget that they are abused by the police. They will forget that their mosques are sometimes ransacked. People are taken into custody. Human Rights Watch points out people are being disappeared, extrajudicial killings.
Sure.
Not merely just, that's for political reasons, or fighting terrorism. You leave families without children, families without brothers, husbands. How does that fit into your narrative of countering violent extremism?
All right. And I'd like to focus more again on this same article that you wrote back in 2011. And you're talking about doing business as usual, because you say Kenya's policies and frameworks have failed to ensure internal security. And it's the same policies that we're still using today. And that's, that business as usual, you say, is a betrayal of Kenya's Vision 2030. But what do you mean, when you say business as usual?
Business as usual is that we don't question why government policies, we don't question why things are not being done. We're going into an election we're under devolution. Devolution requires, essentially, you devolve 14 functions to the counties, and then the people will look at the scorecard for their own governors. But it's all health. It's we set standards, but it's all that hearts and minds sort of thing that is the major component of any counterinsurgency operation or campaign. But we haven't implemented it. The counties are not delivering the health they're supposed to. People are not seeing the benefit of devolution, and yet that's all the nice stuff. These are all the people programs that government is supposed to provide anyway. And the idea of devolution makes sense. We've had devolution in the United States since 1776. You bring service delivery as close to the people as possible. You then can design programs to see what you need to do. You don't, if you have no older people in a county, why do you don't necessarily focus on senior education programs, programs in health for seniors. If you have 50 or 60% of the population are under the age of 18, obviously it's adolescent services, it's education. Now it will be pointed out correctly that many of the schools in Wajir, Mandera, Garissa, Lamu are closed because of insecurity. This is true. If you pull a bunch of teachers off a bus and kill them, yes, they're Christians, but none of the teachers, there were no Muslim teachers on those buses. What you're doing is dividing the people in those counties from the government in Nairobi. And so it's not enough to just say, well, look, we can't assign teachers. We don't have people reporting back to the clinics because of insecurity. It's Al-Shabaab. Therefore, we need to continue fighting terror. But if our war on terror does not provide an environment in which people will go back to serve in clinics, will go back as teachers to be in the schools, something is wrong. It's not that devolution is wrong. It's not that devolution needs to be delayed or deferred forever. It's that our war on terror is not, in fact, producing an environment of peace and security where it matters the most, which is in those counties along the border with Somalia. You know, when you have things like Westgate, it indicates, and the U.S. government has said, don't go to Eastleigh, and I don't buy into everything that the U.S. government says. But it's pointed out as well that anywhere north of Malindi, I guess that's across the bridge on the way to the Italian
north
space
of Malindi, areas of Lamu, Garissa, and
Lamu Island. You see, obviously, we're not able to provide internal security. Our war, and the U.S. government, it's not the job of the United States government to actually send, I don't know, specialists,
security to protect its citizens.
Specialists down to a precinct.
That U.S. advisory is what we will be discussing right after this break. We're speaking to security analyst Andrew Franklin. Of course, it is 1 year since that gruesome attack at El Adde on KDF soldiers in Somalia. We took a short break here on Weekend Express. We'll be right back with more. Advisory on Kenya. You know, U.S. citizens have been told not to go to Lamu, Garissa, Wajir, and as well as areas in Mombasa like the Likoni Ferry. What influenced this advisory?
Well, the advisories have a lot of influence on whether people visit with insurance or pay the rates for insurance. I think it's a matter of great concern that if you look at Operation Linden Chi, was launched after a foreign tourist was murdered in Manda. His wife was kidnapped. Lamu in 2011. Lamu Island, where Ambassador Godek went for the cultural ceremony, that's fine, is also included. A UNESCO World Heritage Site is included on place. Do not go. It's not just don't go to Mpeketoni, and I'm not sure why U.S. citizens would be touring Mpeketoni or Tana, but the fact is it's Lamu Island is not considered secure. And that means also that the airfield, the potential that Al-Shabaab may have to down aircraft has not been curbed. We saw Al-Shabaab in Mogadishu in January of 2016 as part of its year-long successful campaign to derail elections across the border in Somalia, attempted to blow up an airliner, except that the bomb went off, killed the guy carrying it, and because it blew him out of the airplane. It wasn't at the right altitude. I think that's a great concern. The notion that you shouldn't visit Old Town in Mombasa, unless it's during the day, points to some problem which we saw in September when notionally 3 female terrorists attacked the police. We're not sure they were terrorists. We believe they were. It is very much disputed, and I was at the coast and I was interviewed at that time about this terrorist attack. And when I was interviewed, it did seem like it might have been a genuine attack where women got into the police station with suicide vests, but that's not true. But I also pointed out that we can expect this sort of thing. Why don't we expect women to become combatants, especially in an area, Mombasa, where you've had hundreds of youth arrested and then released, catch and release. I think there are still 29 in remand after the mosque occupations. We've had religious leaders, radical or not, have been killed, notionally by the anti-terror police unit. It's never been shown who killed them. And so if you look at that sort of insecurity, you can see why
the U.S. would need to have an advisory.
And the U.S. bureaucrats, the bureaucracy in Washington, nobody's going to say it's perfectly safe. Nobody's going to say, look at how much money we spend in Kenya. It must be safe. And nor are they going to say it's not safe because. Everything is couched in normal bureaucratic language, the potential, the likelihood. But even though it's not even likelihood, but it is a damning indictment of the results of Operation Linden Chi, of our failure to secure our tourist areas. And tourism is, after all, one of the largest foreign exchange earners.
Very true, very true. I mean, let's go back to the situation in Mpeketoni, for example. And you were mentioning earlier that you don't believe that Muslims are the enemy, but this war on terror globally has seemed to sort of split Muslims and Christians right down the middle. And now the situation in Mpeketoni, for example, as soon as you see a woman clad in a buibui, it becomes an issue. And that sort of makes the situation a lot worse because people do not trust each other anymore.
Well, that's certainly true, and I understand that notion of distrust is percolating its way into the KDF as well, where troops don't trust each other. That there are allegations that, and this may be, and it is understandable, that there may be troops who are recruited in our ethnic Somali areas who have family members who may, in fact, be recruited by Al-Shabaab. That's not unusual, but it's also, if we can't guarantee the safety of families in certain areas, obviously Al-Shabaab has leverage over troops who are recruited there. These are things that we shouldn't deny. This happens everywhere. When I said I don't see all Muslims as our enemies, obviously I never have. And I'm a nice Jewish boy from New York City who joined the Marine Corps. I remember seeing a photograph of some of the first Marines into Afghanistan under General Mattis, in fact, who they flew in. There were Muslim Marines cleaning a mosque so that the people could come for prayers. And I said, that's interesting, because although there was another officer when I was commissioned who was from Pakistan, a Muslim, 40 years ago, the thing is, You know, this is never, back then we were fighting communism everywhere, whether it was true or not. I think the notion of a Muslim-Christian divide it fits into certain political strains of Islam. Yes, very true. I pointed out that when people were pulled off a bus and massacred, the fact that they were Christians, they were teachers, they were government civil servants, and I did say they could have been Hindus. They were outsiders.
Right.
And Al-Shabaab's goal is to divorce the people of the counties of Northeast Province from the central government. It is to ensure that they don't feel any real allegiance and no reason to show any loyalty to the government in Nairobi. No amount of countering violent extremism can ever turn around reality if it's the reality on the ground. And if you can't provide security for civilian populations, you can't get information from them.
Right, right.
People do not come up to Mr. Uniform and give him the information about Al-Shabaab, and even if
they feel intimidated.
Well, if they feel that not only will nothing be done because perhaps the administrative structure is unable to respond to intelligence, and I think that keeps coming out as well in Pecatoni and elsewhere, in Garissa, that the NIS gives, National Intelligence Service has been giving actionable intelligence. It gets to the police, and then it disappears. I've said that I believe it's because of our administrative inability, the breakdown of communications, command and control within our security forces. And so this is dating back now to, well, in Pecatoni was June 2014.
Right. And of course, last year we also saw a lot of situations where we had police officers or members of the National Security Force also radicalized. We had a policeman in, I believe it was Baringa County, who tried to break out an Al-Shabaab suspect and ended up killing several of his colleagues as well.
Well, that was at Kaptagat, and this was an officer who had a notion of clean record, who was disenchanted with serving in the police, who apparently had asked either to be released from the police or be transferred closer to home. He was told, drop dead. Basically, you have to do your 10 years, and so you tell a guy who doesn't seem to have big problems, although on his laptop, of course, you can get anything on your laptop. I know, and the thing is, we then said, go away, come back in 7 or 8 years to get your discharge, and we left him with his rifle and his ammunition. That's great. So he then Kaptagat Big Siege. It's never been shown he did that because he was radicalized.
I mean, there were posts on his WhatsApp profile picture on his Facebook pages as well that.
Well, Michelle, you may be more aware of media stories than I am, of course, because you're in the media. But I thought a GSU man killed his girlfriend, shot her with 56 times, and then killed himself. That means that the GSU, with his American-supplied M4 automatic rifle, which means that we have lost control of our firearms in the security forces. You keep it in your house with unlimited amounts of ammunition. He was not radicalized. Apparently, he was just very angry. So we never looked into his laptop to see if he ever got any sort of information from ISIS. So in the case of the man from Kaptagat, we stopped looking into why did he have a rifle? Why do we have to have discipline in the police? But does discipline mean that we have no personnel or human relations in the police any longer? I think also the lack of a police reserve, which is required in our National Police Service Act, means that we have no career paths for people to go in and out of the regulars. This is also true in the KDF. We have not constituted a genuine Kenya Defense Forces reserve. The United States is in no position to go to war any longer without our National Guard and our reservists. And although in May of 2012, when I sent in my comments on the KDF, Kenya Defense Forces bill, as a member of the public, and I attended a stakeholders forum by the CIC. My recommendations, which were then published in the Nairobi Law Monthly about the KDF bill, was that we needed to have a prescription. That is, you must have reserves. You have to have this. You must have that. Now, that didn't make it into the act. However, we don't have unlimited numbers of troops. We're also not looking at other countries' examples. Tanzania has a very large reserve force. which allowed them to overthrow Idi Amin.
Right.
We don't seem to be able to know what to do with our service people. There was the case of KDF members who went off to Iraq to work with U.S. military contractors. And when they came back to Kenya, they were court-martialed. 26, 27 of them. I don't know about their individual circumstances. The one case that did stand out, which I think it was a commissioned officer who apparently deserted his post to go serve to go get a contract in Iraq, and I had no sympathy for him. On the other hand, we have no provision to accommodate soldiers, airmen, sailors, who have finished 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, to ensure that their skills are not lost, that their skills can be used in the civilian community, but also retained in reserves to be used when we need to go someplace and fight. I have met loads of, well, everyone's younger than me now, majors. Seems majors they were in the KDF. And yes, they're doing a lot of good work in private security companies. They're doing a lot of good work in the private sector. But there's no ability to keep track of them, not because they're going to become radicalized, to keep track of them so they can continue serving. It's like, go away, Major. We'll get a lieutenant eventually.
Right.
So we have no provision, and yet we have a Defense Forces Act that is really not being implemented again.
Yes. And before we focus on the war on terror globally, let's talk about the repatriation of refugees back to Somalia. This was also influenced partly by the war on terror in the country, with the government saying that the Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps are harboring a lot of Al-Shabaab sympathizers and Al-Shabaab families themselves. But is this a move that could possibly trigger backlash from Al-Shabaab?
You've asked me about the government GOK pronouncements that should have been implemented by the end of November of 2016. It was impossible to do anyway. I have no doubt that within the camps there is Al-Shabaab influence. Somebody is maintaining law and order in Dadaab, and we know it's not the Kenya police. And but there's a problem. But if you send everyone back, apparently those who went back, there's nothing for them. So I think that it doesn't matter whether they were Al-Shabaab before you sent them back or they become Al-Shabaab after you go back. You've moved the problem to somebody else, that is to Somalia. Now again, and even though the Somali government, such as it is, protested about the closing of the camps, they then eventually went along with it. But any of the refugees who have been repatriated to Sector 2 are in camps of some sort there. I understand that some have gotten back to Mogadishu, but it's a destabilizing influence because there's nothing there for them. There are no international agencies with line items in their budgets to take care of returnees. Give people $100 apiece, go away. So in fact, this has been that also has just disappeared into sort of a vacuum. What has happened to these people? I think we also need to realize that the Kenyan government, at the behest of the United States, recruited from the refugee camps. We also recruited Kenyan citizens of Somali origin to be trained in places like Manyani, to be sent to go fight in Somalia. So essentially, that is a violation. As far as recruiting in refugee camps, that seems to be a violation of international law. I think it makes sense, by the way, but somehow,
there's that
but you
violation.
you can't just ignore it. And then abandon people. Now, the U.S. trainers who were involved in that program, so-called lost boys or war boys, their contracts ended and they went home to the States. And we don't know what happened to all of these.
And this is the communication and the transparency that you've been talking about. But let's talk about the war on terror globally, because as much as the U.S. and other critics say Kenya is failing on the war on terror, we've seen a lot of terror attacks globally, in Europe especially, countries like France and Germany, Turkey as well. How can we explain this?
Well, you see, terrorism is a tactic. I've said that terrorism is not a religion. Terrorism is not something that you sign on to be a terrorist. It's something you do. Terrorism in Europe now, we've seen whether it's a lone wolf versus a group of opportunists, like in Nice, in France, who planned for a year to drive a huge lorry into a crowd.
Right.
We've seen that in Berlin. Not in Berlin. But the point is, these are things that are very difficult to stop. Turkey has a separate problem. It's gotten itself involved in Syria. It also has an active insurgency among its Kurdish population. They've also, since the attempted coup in Turkey in July of 2016, thousands of senior, middle-ranking and senior security officials have either been arrested, fired, suspended, and even if they haven't been, they're being looked at with suspicion because that unsuccessful coup seems to have, they implicated any number of senior officers. On the other hand, the government in Turkey, Erdogan, has a vested interest in ensuring that the military, which has since the General Ataturk and the foundation of modern Turkey, the military in Turkey has always seen itself as the guarantor of a secular Turkish state, a European Turkish state. The last thing that Mr. Erdogan wants is senior officers who still believe that not only are they guarantors of the Ataturk legacy, but they have a right to go into the street, to call their troops to take over the presidential palace.
Right.
So whenever you have this sort of disarray in your security forces, you will have gaps opening up. And whether it's Kurdish terrorists, Islamic State terrorists, who are not happy that Turkish warplanes are bombing them, I wouldn't be happy either. You strike out. And the fact that you may strike out at airports or you strike out at nightclubs, it's horrible. These are non-combatants.
Right, right.
Yeah, except that I would suggest that when we brought World War II to an end, that is the U.S. in the Pacific, we nuked several 100,000 non-combatants in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's not funny, but this is why you don't want to go to war.
Right, all right.
As far as terrorism everywhere, if you look in the United States, some of the terrorism events that we've had, yes, it seems to be inspired by ISIS, but it's also, if you didn't have all those weapons available, floating around your country, the right to bear arms, we wouldn't have had the San Bernardino shooting. We might not have had that major, Haddad, who killed people in Texas.
All right, Andrew.
See, these are things, look, there are so many different factors, but I think I want to just go back to this notion of the divide between Muslims and Christians, because that's very important. Last week, there was a report indicated that Christianity globally is under attack. And it's also under attack in India by Hindu extremists.
Right.
Now, Hindu extremists, these are nationalists who view Christianity as a Western imposition. That Christianity apparently is under threat and pressure in places like Laos and Vietnam. Well, those are still sort of communist countries, legacy. But so Christianity is viewed as a Western influence, and it's also, Christianity has been adopted by marginalized ethnic communities. If you look in Burma, you see that Rohingya Muslims, it's been described as a genocide. Those are Muslims who are being abused, killed, massacred by Buddhists. So it's not just all black and white, and there's many shades of gray. If you live in Kenya, which we do, we really need to demand more effective measures be taken to preserve our national security.
All right, Franklin. Thank you so much, Andrew Franklin, security expert. Brings us to an end here on a Weekend Express. He's been helping us dissect the progress on the war on terror as Kenya commemorates 1 year